Come back, come back. Ooh, that was so effective. Okay, now that you're all stretched and watered, I would like to introduce to you our next speaker, who is also amazing, Pat Scales, who is a retired school librarian and I almost said a lifelong champion, and that's probably true, of freedom to read and intellectual freedom and children's rights to read whatever they want. She has published several books on censorship, and she writes a monthly column in School Library Journal called Scales on Censorship, which I read religiously. And she is going to speak to us this morning a little bit about being on the committee and being a responsible committee member. Come on up, Pat.
Well, if KT is a battle axe, I'm an old battle axe because I'm a lot older than KT. I forget what Roger Sutton called us. What was that? He said, the Dragon Ladies of Valsk. And we were among the Dragon Ladies. So every time I see Roger, he does this to me. KT shared just a little bit about being in the room with Zena Sutherland, a giant in the field. And I have to share briefly, my first experience of the Newbery Committee was in the early 1980s. I was one of 2 librarians on the group that worked with children. Everyone else were all giants in the field. Names some of you may know, some you may not know. And I have to tell you, I was extremely intimidated at that moment. So I would have greatly benefited from this group, from being part of a William Morris seminar. So I'm so glad you're here. I had the great pleasure of being president of this association the year of this very first seminar, and being charged with appointing members to Newbery, Caldecott, Seibert, and Geisel. It was great to have some names to pull from that we knew were great evaluators. And I remember Vicki Smith is sitting back there. She was Seibert chair. And she came up to me at conference and said, do I have you to thank for my committee? And I thought, no, you had the William Morris seminar. So it's not a guarantee immediately, but this is what we're hoping to do, is training good book evaluators. I've had the great pleasure of serving as chair of the Newbery, Caldecott, and Wilder committees. Maybe that's because I'm an old battle axe. I've been around so long. I've had that great pleasure of serving all 3. And I can't tell you how exciting those experiences were. But it was an enormous responsibility. And today, the primary focus of my presentation is going to be on responsibility in the search for the most distinguished. The first responsibility of a committee member is to read the manual. And I understand you're going through maybe some revisions to the manual, but that is the first thing you need to do, is read the manual. And I would encourage people who are not on the committees to read the manual as well, because it's very helpful to see what we're expecting from committees and so forth. It is online and it's easy to access. So I hope some of you in this room have read the manual before you came here. You should note that the manual defines distinguished as marked by eminence and distinction, marked by excellence and quality, marked by conspicuous excellence, and individually distinct. Now, then you have the job of the committee to figure out what all that means. And it will mean different things to different books because they won't all have the same qualities. The Newbery, Caldecott, Geisel, and Seibert have one thing in common. and that they each represent the most distinguished book using the criteria clearly outlined for each specific award. There may be overlap because no committee knows what the other committee is considering. For example, Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson was named Newbery and Seibert Honor Books in 2015. And just remember, distinguished is distinguished. And the fact that another committee could be evaluating the same book shouldn't affect your consideration of it at all. Note, this is extremely important, note the audience for these awards. The ALSC defines our service from birth to age 14. So keep this in mind as you read and evaluate the books. The public and some professionals are often confused by this. For example, people have the idea that Caldecott is for younger audiences and Newbery for older. But in 2016, Last Stop on Market Street by Matt Dagapena was a picture book won the Newbery. The book also received a Caldecott honor. In 1982, the Newbery Medal went to A Visit to William Blake's Inn, 9 Poems for Innocent and Experienced Travelers by Nancy Willard, a picture book. It was also named a Caldecott honor that year. I have a friend who said it was for 8-year-old William Blake scholars. In 2017, the Newbery Honor, Freedom Over Me, 11 Slaves, Their Lives and Dreams, brought to life by Ashley Bryan, which is heavily illustrated but beautifully written, was a Newbery Honor book. But most people think of Ashley as primarily an illustrator or a storyteller, and his book won honor. In 2006, the Newbery Honor went to Showway by Jacqueline Woodson, which is also heavily illustrated. 2000, Newbery Honor, 26 Fairmont Avenue by Tommy DePaula. Yet most people think of DePaula as an illustrator, though we all know that he is also a good writer. In 1983, the Newbery Honor, 1983, yes, Newbery Honor, Dr. DeSoto by William Stagg was named a Newbery Honor book, and that was the year I was on the Newbery Committee. And when he was called to tell he had won a Newbery Honor, he said, "Are you sure, isn't it another award, not this one?" He thought that we probably really meant Caldecott. And we said, no, we mean Newbery. In 1973, this could be a test for KT, Frog and Toad Together by Arnold LaBelle, an early reader that might today be considered for Geisel, won a Newbery Honor book. Caldecott in 2008, The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Brian Selznick was an honor book. It was the Caldecott winner, I'm sorry. In 1990, a Caldecott honor was Bill Pete, an autobiography, which is 192 pages long, but it is heavily illustrated. So you can't go by the format of the book on what is distinguished by award, because we've got precedent here. And so we hope that as you look at picture books, you will consider the writing as much as the illustration, or if you have a heavily illustrated, much longer book, that you will look at the illustrations for that. The committee's responsibility, and you're probably going to hear me say this a lot, the committee's responsibility is to the books. It is not to a particular author or illustrator, not to a specific publisher, and not to you as a committee member. It is focused on the books. Keep this in mind. It's always, always about the books, and KT mentioned this. It is not about you. It is not about what is popular with children. Just last September, I was invited to Fairbanks, Alaska to speak to a group, and I did many presentations while I was there, but one was on the Caldecott. They didn't get it. They said, kids don't want to read some of these books. And I said, well, we're not about what kids will read. There is a kid out there that will read it. A child, you will always find a child reader. I said, but if we go by popularity, Captain Underpants would win one of these awards every year. So it's not about popularity, it's about distinguished. And no, we cannot go back in time and wish it had been given to Charlotte's Web, or wish that it had been given to Tuck Everlasting or to Wanda. Popular books with children, yes, but only the committees in those years know why not. You know, they chose what they did. It's our job eventually as librarians to introduce kids to all of these distinguished books, and I can guarantee you there will be a reader for them. My goddaughter's children go to a private school in Southern California, and in kindergarten, the grandmother, who is a friend of mine, kind of was bragging to me. Oh, in kindergarten, they have to read all the Caldecott winners. And I said, I hope not. And then she said, and in third grade, they have to read all the Newberries. And I said, I hope not. I said, I can probably count on two hands the number of Newbery books that would appeal to third graders. I mean, you're going to always have some individual kids that would respond, you know, but for a whole class to have to read them all. But that was their way of thinking they were accelerating these kids. And this is not about, you know, making them read. This is about introducing them to distinguished, and if they're made to read them in that way, I think it's a terrible assignment. And some kids won't just be ready for some of these books. I mean, think of Jacob Have I Loved and Dicey's Song and some of the books that have been named over the years. No third grader would even care. And if they're made to read them at a young age, then by the time they're old enough for the books, they may dismiss it because they hated it as a third grader. Let me just say this again, and I'm going to say it all the way through this presentation. It's not about you as an individual. It's only about the books. I can't stress this enough. And committee members must behave in a manner that supports and preserves the integrity of the task at hand. And let me give you a couple of examples of why I keep saying this. ALSC has a very strict conflict of interest policy, and committee members are asked to sign it. If there's a conflict of interest, your first responsibility is to disclose. You may be asked to step down until it is resolved. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't have another opportunity. All committee discussion must be absolutely confidential in these committee meetings. Titles under consideration must be confidential as well. This means you don't talk with colleagues about these titles and not let them know they're on a list for consideration. You don't take to social media about specific titles or deliberations. This is because these awards are extremely important. They're important to the writers, to the illustrators, to the publishers, and you don't want any of this out, because then they start thinking, oh, we may win the Newbery, And it's not that some of them might think they are anyway, but that's their own. It didn't come from a committee member. I once had a writer say to me, he was not an illustrator, a writer, but he did a lot of poetry, and they were heavily illustrated books. And he said that someone on the Caldecott committee told him that the illustrator of one of his books was under consideration from the Caldecott Committee and likely would win. So I told him such a statement should have never been made because that committee member was out of line and should have never been made. First of all, you can come to this conference, you can come to a midwinter conference when the decision's being made, and you may think you have in your mind what you think would win based on numbers of nominations, and it can fall off the table immediately. So you don't know as a committee member what's going to win because we use that formula to reach a consensus. So no comment like that should ever be made. At that point, I will say he was very embarrassed that he had said that to me, but it was the committee member that was wrong. You will see blog posts, Facebook posts, and Twitter posts by people who want to state their idea of what is the most distinguished. That is not to be considered by the committee. I mean, if you see it, you see it, and we have lots of mock Newberry, mock New Caldecotts out there, and it all gets posted. It's fine. You read it, dismiss it. It's what the committee thinks when they come together. As tempting as it may be, do not respond to those posts. Just don't engage. And I know it's fun to be on those state things on the blogs and the listservs, but it is not a good idea as a committee member because you just don't need to be out there. Each committee member must abide by the timeline as outlined by the chair, and that's also in the manual. At what point that, the chair will outline when, nominations should be made and so forth. And the timeline is a strict timeline. You must respond to that. And I think that because then that way it starts to shape on rereading. And the chair's role is to get those nominations out to the entire committee. I will say to you, and this I didn't even have as a point, but it's very important to respond to chairs in email, but to read through the entire email before responding. It's kind of like KT mentioned with the child with the hand up. It's I taught children's lit for 27 years at Furman University, and I would say, I'm going to go over the syllabus, and I'll entertain questions afterwards. And I'd get through Roman numeral 1, and I taught the graduate school, so they were all teachers. Their hands were up like this. And it was so irritating. But I had a committee member that would do that on email, respond to all, and it would be asking a question about what was in the second paragraph. It's very irritating. And finally, somebody on the committee said, "This is confusing me." So I had to, as chair, say, please read the entire email before we ask questions. And so that's important too, because that's a version of hand being up constantly. Everyone on the committee is expected to make nominations at the appropriate times. And the nominations must make it perfectly clear why you think the book is distinguished. You don't need to write an annotation of the book. You need to state why you're nominating it. What are its distinguishing qualities? It's changed over the years, and I think this has been one of the things, one change that ALSC has made that is absolutely terrific. Because there was a time that if someone even mentioned a book in the spring, and you got to know in the spring when books are coming out and it gets all exciting, you get these new books, and you'll call attention to, I read this, maybe you should read this. Even if a book did not get a nomination back in the day, the committee had to still leave it part of the discussion. So you spent the whole, first meeting just about getting books off the table. Now, when you have to think through these nominations very carefully, because now the only books that are discussed at midwinter and considered are the ones that have been nominated. And I think that is a great change. And a lot of it was a time issue too, because now ALA wants these winners so much earlier, and if you're spending your whole first day just getting books off the table that haven't even been nominated, if you feel strongly about a book that it is distinguished, then nominate it. All books nominated must be read, and in some cases reread if necessary. For example, when I was Newberry Chair, we had a book that received multiple nominations. It was a nonfiction work, and upon reread, we found an issue that clearly didn't meet the criteria of what we thought was excellent nonfiction. It was not caught on the first read. It was caught on a reread. And I think nonfiction, and Vicki could probably speak to this, is especially tough, because it may be a topic you know very little about, but you still apply the good criteria, and this was something that we felt was missing in the end. So though it had multiple nominations, it didn't receive any accolades that year. The decision is made collectively, and as KT was talking about in book discussion, and there is a process by which we go through to reach a consensus. It may not, the book that you feel strongly about may not be the one that wins, but there's a process to get there. KT's already mentioned that personal experiences should not be considered. And things like this, because I remember hearing this comment when Marsha Brown's Shadow won Caldecott. I remember someone saying, and this was not someone on the committee, oh, she didn't like that book. She said, because I've been to Kenya, and that's not the color of the Kenyan sky. Well, actually, Marsha Brown went to Kenya in preparation for that book, I think. And the Kenyan sky is different depending on the season you're there. So I think we have to be careful, when we make such comments as committee members, but even as outside people, to realize just because you happen to be in Kenya, it may be the time of year when it was very different looking than... I actually showed that book to my brother who lived in Kenya for 15 years, I think. And he felt that the colors were the Kenyan sky that he had seen many times. Or there could be a comment like, oh, my daughter takes tap dancing, and this is not, in this book, this is not the way tapping is done. Well, who's to say people tap in different ways? I mean, just because your daughter takes tap dancing doesn't mean this isn't the way the tapping was done by the main character in a picture book, or the way they have to illustrate the tapping in a picture book. Or, as KT said, that book would never fly in my library. Well, we live in all parts of the country. We work with all different aged kids. And I have worked with all age kids from elementary through high school, and I can tell you they're all very different, and what they will read is all very different. And so some will greatly appreciate books that others don't get at all. The decision shouldn't be made simply because you as a committee want to make a statement by naming a particular book. And I think that I've heard comments like in the 1970s. I think we went through with that a little bit. I mean, we became really aware of certain kinds of books we wanted to see. And so books might have been named that might not have been named 10 years later. But the criteria outlined in the manual is your guide for evaluation, not because you want to say to the world, I'm making a statement by. I mean, if you were going to make a statement, then a book like I Am Jazz might win. And while that book has a great place in our library collections, it would probably not meet the criteria for distinguished book. But we need the book. We need a lot of things in our libraries that are not going to always be named distinguished. A statement from the manual says, because the literary qualities to be considered will vary depending on content, the committee need not expect to find excellence in each of the named elements, The book should, however, have distinguished qualities in all of the elements pertinent to it. For example, you really can't compare two genres. You must determine which is most distinguished by the criteria outlined, and the books that we'll be discussing today represent that because we have a very varied group, and that is very much represents what someone might see in a Newbery or a Caldecott committee. For example, how do you compare Russell Freeman's Lincoln, a photobiography, which won the Newbery in 1988, with Gary Paulson's Hatchet, which was a 1988 honor book? They had to do that. That committee had to look at distinguished, and the book that ended up emerging as winner is not a discredit to the honors because they're great too, but might have just people as a group felt that it might have had just a little bit more of the distinguishing qualities. Gary Paulson's in nonfiction versus Hatchet, which would win a popularity contest too, I think Hatchet has over the years. You will receive complaints, no matter what. And the answer should always be, it was a committee choice. It's simple. It was a committee choice. There are always people who think they know better than the committee about what should win. It's likely that the mock book evaluation groups across the nation haven't read or even seen all of the books under consideration. They have no way of knowing what books are nominated. So they often make their lists from starred reviews, which is a good place for them to start. But trust me, some will want to know why their book didn't win. For example, I got an email from a first grade teacher, and the committee member's email is pretty readily available on the ALF's website, especially the chairs. And she wrote to me after the year that we had named Caldecott, telling me that her class didn't understand why their book didn't win, and could I please offer an explanation? So I simply wrote her back and I said, I'm glad your class had a mock Caldecott. It's a great experience for them to learn to read and discuss the same books, and just as we did, but it was a committee choice, and that I applaud them for the process, and that's just all I said. But I didn't comment on why their book didn't win. I'm not even sure now if it was, I can't even remember the book that she wrote to me about, but so it might not have even been nominated. I don't know. I even had that very year a former Caldecott chair to let me know or to ask me. I was in the airport going home after the banquet that year and demanded to know why a certain book didn't win, and it was her favorite of that year. And my answer, you of all people should know the process. And that's just, what do you say? And we do, but we forget it. Those of us that have been there, we tend to forget. So it's just a good idea to always say, it was a process, and it's okay, I think, to outline the distinguished qualities of the book that won to them, and we felt this, but but don't comment on books that didn't to them, because that's just not information that they need to have. In the end, committees will name a distinguished book. And there are sometimes through the process you wonder if we're going to get there. But will it be a perfect book? No, it won't be a perfect book. Perfect is subjective. But will it be every committee member's favorite book, a first choice? No, probably not. That's why there's a process for reaching a consensus. But when the committee leaves the room, they must be unified. In the 1980s, I won't name the book, a committee member that had been on the committee that year came up to me on the exhibit floor and said, "I'm sorry about the book." Of course, he gave me the title of the book. That was a very inappropriate comment from him. Well, if you go way back that far, we didn't have our strict rules of things. And it should have, to me, I thought it was inappropriate at the time, and I was a novice at all of this. But it was a very inappropriate, and it was a book that won Newbery. Okay, I'm going to take some questions at the end, but before I do, I want us to consider another important thing, and I'm going to name some books, and this is audience participation. And I want you to raise your hand if you've read them. The Higher Power of Lucky. Oh, great. Of course, that is a much newer book. Bud Not Buddy. The Midwife's Apprentice. Walk Two Moons. The Giver. Shallow. Maniac McGee. KT's hand's just staying up there. Jacob Have I Loved. The Westing Game. Bridge to Terabithia. You were just mere kids probably reading those. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Slave Dancer. Ooh, we're getting fewer hands. Julie of the Wolves. Okay. Sounder. The High King. A Wrinkle in Time. Whoa, good. And a lot of stuff coming out on Wrinkle in Time lately. The Witch of Blackbird Pond. Amos Fortune Free Man. Johnny Tremaine. Okay, what do they have in common? They're all Newbery winners. That's exactly right. What about these? Al Capone Does My Shirts. Olive's Ocean. Hoot. Because of Winn-Dixie. Oh, yeah, look at those hands. Ella Enchanted. The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963. What Jamie Saw. Catherine Called Birdie. Crazy Lady. Woo. KT, you just might as well keep your hand up, but some of the others are not coming up when I'm getting to these old ones. Shabanu. After the Rain. Hatchet. Oh, My Anna. Like Jake and Me. Vic is running KT a close second back there. The Moves Make the Man. Oh, just a few. The Sign of the Beaver. The Great Gilly Hopkins. Abel's Island. Dragon Wings. Some of My German Soldier. The Upstairs Room. The Witches of Worm. Oh, wow. KT, what's wrong? Oh, okay. The Headless Cupid. Oh, The Headless Cupid. In Little Town on the Prairie. Okay, what do those have in common? Newbery Honor books. Okay, we've determined that these are Newbery Medal and Newbery Honor books. However, there's something else they have in common. But before we do that, I want to let's look at these Caldecott Medal and Honor books. Smoky Night, have you read it? St. George and the Dragon. Sylvester and the Magic Pebble. Where the Wild Things Are, of course. They were strong and good. Ooh, that goes way back, KT. Tar Beach, Little Red Riding Hood, the Trina Hyman one. Outside over there, The Amazing Bone, In the Night Kitchen, Crow Boy. Okay, all of the books I've named, you notice I've left some Newbery and Newberyana Caldecott's out. All of these have something else in common. What do you think it is? They have all been challenged or banned. So I want to talk just a little bit about that because a committee cannot worry about this, and we're going to go through this process a little bit. Okay, you're going to wonder why on some of these. And some of them, if you go way back, would not even be an issue today, but it was an issue at the time. The higher power of lucky was one of the first ones I named, and so some of you may or may not remember all the hoopla that happened with the higher power of lucky. But I want to just take you through that a minute to tell you the power of the media and what we have to deal with. And trust me, we will deal with it, so don't worry about that, and we're going to get into that. It all started, I don't know if you know how that case started. How many of you know what happened with the higher power of lucky? Oh, there are a few that don't, so let me just quickly take you through it. There was a librarian, actually here in Colorado, on LMNet, who simply asked the question, is anybody going to buy that book for their library? It's got the word scrotum. Well, the New York Times ended up with that question some way. You never know when newspapers are on these listservs or have someone that will report it to them or whatever. And they had this huge article in the New York Times. Children's librarians, I forget the headline now, something like, Newbery winner has bad...
it was something like multitudes of children's librarians ban Newbery.
Ban Newbery, yeah. So we're going to ban. So I got called to defend that book. Well, I have to tell you, I did not leave my house for one solid week. It was one interview after another. Because then there were a lot in newspapers all over the country, some smaller, some in major cities, that picked up the New York Times story, and they wanted to kind of take on the New York Times a little too. So, you know, well, what do you think about the word scrotum in this book? And I wanted, in fact, I was interviewed by the New York Times. I wanted to say, what did you want them to say, balls? But then they would have put it really up there. So that's when you have to know how to interview with the press, because trust me, you got to know when to leave it out and when to. So it was one solid week we defended this book on talk radio stations, on newspapers across the nation. But the last interview I did that week was on NPR. By the way, I was not on the committee. I was just asked to defend it by the ALA Public Affairs Office. The last interview I did that week was an NPR interview, call-in. At least it wasn't one of these AM call-ins. I've done those too, and they're pretty bad. And Susan Patrone actually was in the station taking calls too. And all these people called in about the book. And finally, this little girl called in. I think she said she was 10, 9 or 10. And the hostess for the show said, I want to ask you a question. Do you know what the word scrotum means? And she said, well, I didn't at the beginning of the book, but at the end I did. The whole point. You know, when at the end she asked her guardian, by the way, what is scrotum? And she tells her. Well, it's because she didn't have anybody to ask before. She, was searching for a mother, so to speak, and she didn't have anyone she could ask. So trust me, the media is going. If the media gets this, it flies all over the nation anymore. And the sad kind of thing was that it all came from this LMNet, when someone probably meant to be asking an innocent question, and then it got blown all out of proportion with the media. In case you're wondering on some of these others, I can tell you why they have been challenged. Bud Not Buddy is for profanity, language, and violence. And you have to know that the American Library Association collects these things. We don't always reveal where the challenges are because we do promise anonymity if a library wants it. But with the press the way it is, it's not always anonymous anymore. But there are just certain categories we have them checked, what their problem is. The midwife's apprentice was just deemed not appropriate for middle school students. Walk Two Moons, depressing. That was the reason. The Giver, sexual content and euthanasia. That one hit pretty fast. That case came up very quickly after it was named. And one of the most volatile, the first case that I saw that appeared in a newspaper was in Louisiana. And I've actually seen a letter that Lois Lowry wrote to them that's beautifully written. And shallow, profanity, lying, and religious viewpoint. Because Marty says, what is it he says? Jesus, please help me save this dog or something, and that was religious viewpoint. Maniac McGee, racism. Jacob Have I Loved, offensive language and moral and religious grounds. The Western Game, violence. Bridge to Terabithia, profanity, negative views of life, and witchcraft. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, racism and language. Slave Dancer, too graphic depiction of the slave trade. Julia the Wolf, sexual content and violence. Sounder, language, and the word boy in reference to a black sharecropper. The High King, religious themes that are pagan. That happened a lot for a period of time with fantasy. A Wrinkle in Time, witchcraft and undermines religious beliefs. The Witch of Blackbird Pond, witchcraft and culturally offensive. Specifically the word scrawl in reference to a Native American woman. Amos Fortune Free Man, racist dialogue and stereotypes. Johnny Tremaine, violence. Now, in the Newbery Honors, Al Capone Does My Shirts is profanity, and I don't even think I know where that profanity is in that book. But Olive's Ocean, sexually explicit and profanity. Hoot, profanity, including damn and smart ass. Because of Winn-Dixie, profanity. Ella Enchanted, adult content. That's an ambiguous reason, but that's one you see a lot. The Watson's Go to Birmingham 1963 is racism, political view, and language. I have to tell you, I was at a university in Wisconsin, not the University of Wisconsin, another one, speaking one time, and a woman came up to me and told me that she was a librarian in a private school, and an African-American mother did not want her child to read this book because she didn't want her child to know the civil rights movement ever existed. Well, first of all, certainly it is set in the Jim Crow South as they go from Michigan to the South, and it is an important period it was a defining moment, that tragedy and our turnaround. But what's the book really about? It's not really about the civil rights movement. What happened in Birmingham is what brought those two brothers together in the end. What Jamie saw is profanity and inappropriate language. Catherine called Bertie anti-Semitic values, crazy lady, swear words, specifically damn, hell, and bitch 5 times. They like to count them. Trust me. They would like to count them and tell you exactly how many are in there. Shabanu, sexual content, After the Rain, profanity and sexual content, Hatchet, graphic depiction of trauma, Oh My Honor, profanity and depressing, Like Jake and Me, sexual content, Moves Make the Man, violence, Sound of the Beaver, culturally offensive, specifically using squaw for a Native American woman, The Great Gilly Hopkins, profanity and graphic violence, Abel's Island, references to drinking wine, Dragon Wings, as we hold our wine glasses, Dragon Wings, graphic violence, profanity, alcohol, drug use, Some of My German Soldier, profanity, negative views, and offensive racial stereotypes, The Upstairs Room, profanity, The Witches of Worm, the occult and fantasy about immoral acts, The Headless Cupid, occult, condones trespassing and lying, and Little Town on the Prairie, offensive to Native Americans. Smoky Nights is violence and horror. St. George and the Dragon, violence. Sylvester and the Magic Pebble is an interesting one because it has had two different censorship problems years apart. And it reflects what goes on in society at the moment. This is a perfect example for that. Because when this book was named Caldecott in the 1970s, it received all kinds of problems because the policemen were pigs. Well, after that, that kind of died down. And about 10 years later, in the 1980s, when we were in a new movement in this nation, not wanting the kids to imagine and not, and it was all about, so we had a problem with it when Sylvester turns into a rock, because that's an out-of-body experience, is what the person said. I shared this with a group of kids when I go into classrooms and talk about censorship, and they said, Miss Scales, what's an out-of-body experience? And I said, I don't know, I've never had one. And also because just the magic in general they didn't like. So now we're past that, and to my knowledge, we haven't had any recent problems with Sylvester. Where the Wild Things Are, because it was dark and frightening, it turns out the only people that were afraid were the adults, not the kids. They Were Strong and Good, glorifies slavery and racism. Tar Beach, racial stereotype, the adults drank beer. When they're on Tar Beach and it's 4th of July or whatever and they're having a picnic. Little Red Riding Hood, because there's a bottle of wine in her basket. Outside Over There, because it's frightening. The Amazing Bone, graphic and detailed violence. In the Night Kitchen, nudity. And Crowboy promotes racial separation. So all these books have been challenged and in some cases removed from libraries for the reasons I've given. Perhaps the most recent controversy that we've dealt with, and we've had a lot of controversy on this book, is This One Summer. Some of you may have even experienced it in your library. I don't know. This is the book that the ALSC office has told me that has received the most complaints ever that they can think of. And it's because of the sexual content inappropriate for audience, they say. This book is more appropriate for the top end of our age range that we consider. But because we did go up to age 14, the answer that I had to give in many interviews with people who were challenging this book is it met the criteria. It meets the criteria. And this is why it is our responsibility, not just as committee members, but as ALSC members, as librarians, to let people know that we don't focus on a certain age. It goes from birth to age 14, and we need to let our patrons know that, and they make their choices accordingly. So, we defended the book. We can. I have not yet found a book I can't defend. I have occasionally found a case where it was being used with the wrong audience, and you may just simply have to say, well, just put it back and maybe they'll come back to it later. A committee should not base its decision on whether a book may bring controversy. As you can see from the examples I've given, you really can't predict what may cause someone to challenge a book. It just depends on what's going on, at the moment, and you never know. And what will fly in one section of the country may not fly in another. But I can tell you that there's not a section of the country that's not affected by censorship, because just in the interviews I do and the work that I have done, I can tell you not one single state has been immune from it. It probably happens more in school libraries than in public, but I do get, and in my column, I've just finalized my column for the March column for School Library Journal right before I came, and I did have questions from public librarians. Am I out of time? Okay. Let me just quickly say this. Distinguish is distinguish again, and always keep that in mind, regardless of language, themes, and so on that could be problematic, because if it fits, it fits. And a good example is, and the Great Kelly Hopkins wouldn't be the same book without the profanity and graphic violence. After all, she was a foster child, had been abused. So Gilly was not likely to say, oh, doggone it. So if the language is appropriate, it's appropriate. The Giver would not be the same book if the community in which Jonas lives didn't practice euthanasia or adolescents given the pill at the time of the stirrings. I wish I'd had some of those pills when I worked at middle school. So just know that those of you who spend countless hours defending books, that those of us who spend countless hours defending books, we are there to defend them. We will defend these books. So I can't think of a book I cannot defend. I have to tell some schools that The Giver is best understood by older readers, not third graders, or that this one summer is more along the emotional development of middle schoolers, but they are part of our audience, which is why I think it's a terrible assignment to require kids to read all Newbery, Caldecott, and Seibert books. A committee should just do their job and search for the distinguished, and that includes controversial subject matter. So let me just leave you with this. C.S. Lewis once said, "A children's story is the best art form for something you have to say. It's up to the book evaluation committees to decide what a book says and how it is said within the criteria of the awards." Thank you.
All right, you guys, we have a little time for a snack, and then you get to disperse to your rooms to try this out now that you've heard from my two professional heroes. So I'm going to push the schedule back like 10 minutes. So if you can be in your group from like 10:25 to 11:25, does that give you enough time to get a little snack and do whatever you need to do, and then meet in your group from 10:25 to 11:25, and then 11:25 come back in here. And if you have questions for Pat and KT at lunch, I bet you can hit them up. Okay, thanks. Get something to eat.